The high street woke in stages, not all at once. First came the shutters, metal rattling up on tracks at 8:30 or 9, depending on the shop. You could hear them from streets away, that grinding scrape of steel on steel, sometimes rusty, always loud enough to mark the official start of trading. The baker had usually been up since 5, so his door was already open when the butcher across the road started wrestling with his padlock. Delivery vans arrived next, blocking the pavement while crates of milk or boxes of tins got humped through narrow doorways into back rooms that smelled of damp and old wood. The grocer would be out front with a broom, sweeping yesterday's crisp packets and fag ends into the gutter before anyone turned up. By 9:30, the newsagent had his sandwich board out. The ironmonger was arranging buckets on the pavement, and the first pensioners were queuing outside the post office before it opened at 10. The street had its own rhythm. Everyone knew when Mrs. Davies from the Drapers would appear with her duster. The fishmonger's van pulled up Tuesdays and Fridays. The bank manager arrived in his Rover at 8:45, exactly. The local bakery opened before dawn, quietly establishing itself as the high street's first operational business each day. By 7 in the morning, bread was already cooling on wooden racks, and the smell drifted down the pavement, pulling people from their homes. This timing was deliberate. Bread needed to be fresh for breakfast and fresh again for tea, which meant baking in shifts throughout the day. The baker knew this rhythm shaped everything else around it. You planned your morning walk to coincide with the first batch. The queue formed naturally, regulars nodding to one another, nobody particularly chatty at that hour, but comfortable in the routine. Behind the counter, the baker or his assistant remembered preferences without asking. 1 bloomer, sliced thick, 2 cottage loaves for the weekend, a dozen buns for the children. This personal service created dependency, but the comfortable kind. You relied on the baker the same way you relied on daylight. The shop itself was simple, wooden counters worn smooth paper bags stacked ready, flour dust forever in the air. It held the neighborhood together without trying to, just by opening on time and knowing what people needed before they spoke. The traditional butcher's shop had a smell you'd recognize instantly, sawdust and raw meat, metallic but not unpleasant. Fresh sawdust went down every morning to soak up blood and drips from the cutting. Carcasses hung from steel hooks, sides of beef and pork visible through the window. Inside, meat sat on white marble slabs behind glass, kept cool without proper refrigeration. Handwritten prices were scribbled on little cards stuck into the displays. The butcher knew you by name and remembered what you'd bought last week. Ask for advice, and he'd tell you exactly how to cook a cut, the time and temperature, without checking anything. If you wanted a joint for Sunday, he'd pull one from the back, trim it in front of you, and wrap it in white paper with the price on top. It was expertise built up over years, often passed from father to son. His reputation lived or died on whether your roast turned out right. You trusted him because he'd been at the block since leaving school. The greengrocer was never a quiet place. You would hear them before you saw them, shouting out their wares from the street. In the early 1900s, greengrocers kept their doors wide open, whatever the weather, with wooden crates stacked outside, showing off whatever was in season. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, cabbages, all of it straight from the ground, unwashed, still covered in soil. The crates were rough wood, splintery, nothing fancy. Inside you would find the same setup, more crates lined up, everything on display where you could see it. The greengrocer, or often his wife, stood behind scales made of the balanced type with heavy brass weights on one side and a metal scoop on the other. They would weigh out your spuds or onions rapid fire, hardly pausing between customers, but there was always time for a bit of chat. How is your mother doing? Have you tried these carrots? Did you see that business down the road? Buying vegetables was not just about handing over coins and walking away. You stood in the queue, you waited your turn, you talked to the person serving you, and probably to the woman next to you as well. It was social, it was loud, it was part of the fabric of the street. The old ironmonger or hardware store was a strange sort of paradise. You'd walk in, and the place looked chaotic. Tiny drawers and dusty bins stacked floor to ceiling, barely room to turn around, but the bloke behind the counter knew exactly where everything was. You could arrive with half a broken hinge or a mysterious screw, and he'd vanish into the back, returning 30 seconds later with the exact match. These shops stocked everything you could need, from common nails to obscure plumbing fittings that hadn't been made in 20 years. The knowledge wasn't written down, it was just in his head, built up over decades of solving people's domestic crises. When you explained your problem, you weren't just buying a part, you were getting a consultation. He'd tell you how to fix it properly, what tools you'd need, maybe draw a diagram on the back of your receipt. This was repair culture in action, right there on the high street. These places encouraged you to fix things rather than chuck them out, to understand how your house actually worked. It was practical knowledge passed person to person. Woolworths landed on British high streets in 1909 with a simple idea: sell a bit of everything for 3p or 6p. That first shop in Liverpool nearly sold out on day one, with people queuing round the block for cheap sweets, china and toys. Within 20 years, a new Woolies was opening somewhere in Britain every 17 days. By the 1960s, there were over 1,000 branches, each with that bright red signboard acting like a beacon drawing people in. What made Woolies work was that it wasn't trying to be posh or special. You could wander in for a bag of pick and mix, grab some emergency birthday wrapping paper, browse the toys, maybe pick up a cheap kettle or some knickers. Everything was affordable, nothing felt intimidating. The shop layout actually encouraged you to browse rather than march in with a list and march straight back out. For generations of British shoppers, Woolies was just there, as ordinary as a postbox, as familiar as your local pub. It sold nothing you desperately needed, but somehow had everything you might want. When the last shops closed in 2009, people mourned like they'd lost an old friend. Shop windows turned retail into theatre sometime around the 1890s. Before plate glass became cheap enough to produce in massive sheets, shop fronts were dark and cramped affairs where goods sat piled up behind small panes. Once you could manufacture windows the size of a wall, everything changed. Suddenly, the street itself became the showroom and pedestrians became an audience. The French had a term for it that says everything you need to know about the appeal, lécher vitrines, which translates literally as licking the windows. Department stores in London and New York began transforming their displays seasonally, and Christmas became the main event. You would see entire scenes built in the windows, dolls having tea parties, mechanical Santa figures, fake snow drifting across miniature villages. The point was not just to show what was for sale, but to create desire through spectacle. People started making special trips just to walk past and look, not necessarily to buy. This was window shopping in its purest form, consumption through the eyes alone. The displays became events in themselves, unveiled like stage productions, often behind privacy screens that would be dramatically removed on opening night. When you walked down a neighborhood shopping street in the late 18th century or early 20th century, you saw a line of family names over the doors. Smith and Sons Grocers, Johnson the Butcher, Williams Family Bakery. This was personal commerce, and the name above told you exactly who you were dealing with. The proprietor usually lived upstairs or nearby, so they were part of the community in every sense. You might see Mrs. Johnson behind the counter one day and Mr. Johnson the next. Their reputation was literally written on the building, which meant they had every reason to treat you fairly. If the bread was stale or the meat dodgy, everyone in the neighborhood would know within hours, and the family name would suffer. This visibility created accountability in a way corporate chains never could. The continuity was striking too. A shop might carry the same family name for decades, even generations. When ownership changed, the new name went up, marking a shift in the street's character. These name boards were more than advertising. They were a form of neighborhood mapping, a way of knowing who belonged where and who stood behind the goods you purchased. Walking into a shop meant being greeted by name, not by a plasticized hello from a stranger behind a till. The butcher knew your family preferred their chops thick cut. The grocer remembered your mother always bought that particular brand of tea. These weren't special gestures, they were just how things worked when you shopped in the same handful of places week after week, year after year. Shopkeepers tracked details without writing them down. They'd ask after your sister who'd been poorly, or mention they'd saved the last jar of something they knew you liked. Kids sent on errands were recognized immediately, trusted with change and instructions because everyone knew whose child they were. It wasn't about being friends exactly, more about being woven into the same daily fabric. You felt seen in a way that's hard to explain now when you can buy everything without speaking to anyone at all. That recognition reinforced something quiet but important. You belonged somewhere, people noticed your routines, and your custom genuinely mattered to the person taking your money. Shopping wasn't just a transaction, it was confirmation you existed in someone else's mental map of the neighborhood. Shopping in early 20th century Britain meant making a circuit rather than a single stop. You went to the baker for bread, the butcher for meat, the greengrocer for vegetables, then the grocer for tea and sugar. Each shop stocked only its particular goods, so a proper trip involved visiting half a dozen places at minimum. Women developed familiar routes through the high street, moving from one shopfront to the next in sequence. It was time-consuming because each customer had to wait whilst the shopkeeper weighed, wrapped, and handled every item individually. Social chit-chat was expected, which added minutes to each transaction. Children were sent on small errands when something had been forgotten. Fetch a loaf from the baker, pick up a pound of sugar. These quick trips kept youngsters moving up and down the street several times a week. The shopping basket, made of heavy wickerwork, grew heavier with each stop. Some women had to make multiple journeys simply because they couldn't carry everything in one go. It was hard physical work without motorcars to transport purchases home. Saturday was the day the whole town came alive, when everyone showed up at once and the high street felt like it actually mattered. During the week, the shops ticked along with their regulars and the odd shopper, but come Saturday morning the streets filled up. People came in from the outlying villages, workers who'd just been paid, families doing the weekly shop, teenagers looking for somewhere to hang about. The rhythm was predictable in a good way. Fathers who worked Monday through Saturday morning arrived in town by 1 o'clock. Mothers who'd been stuck at home all week finally got out, and by mid-afternoon the pavements were thick with people carrying shopping bags, moving between the butcher, the hardware store, the chemist. Some shops stayed open until 7 or 8 at night, knowing they'd take more money on Saturday than the previous 5 days combined. You'd see the same faces every week, neighbours catching up outside Woolworths, men queuing at the barber without an appointment because Saturday was barber day and you just turned up. The town centre became a shared space in a way it never was during the week, everyone mixing together, part of the same weekly ritual. Nobody was in much of a hurry. It gave the place a sense of importance, like this was where things happened, where you needed to be. A busy high street needed people moving through it constantly. Not just a few stragglers here and there, but proper foot traffic. Hundreds or thousands of bodies walking the pavement every hour. This movement created the energy that made a high street feel alive. You had people strolling slowly, window shopping, stopping to chat with someone they bumped into. You had purposeful walkers cutting through to catch a bus, and shoppers laden with bags pausing to check a list or shift their load. All these different speeds and purposes mixed together created what planners called footfall, and it mattered immensely. Shops relied on it. The more people walking past, the more potential customers might stop and come in. A street with heavy foot traffic generated higher sales than a quiet one. Simple as that. But the flow of people also shaped the atmosphere, making the street feel safe, sociable, worth lingering on. When pedestrian numbers dropped off, say after shops closed or on a dead weekday morning, the whole character changed. The street felt empty, sometimes unwelcoming, because that human current had drained away. The high street ran on rituals, not grand ceremonies, but the small repeated acts that gave structure to your week. Every Saturday, Jean would go shopping in town with her mother. The same route, the same shops, from the age of 6 right up until she had her first child. You'd catch the same bus at the same time, take the same shortcut through the narrow streets, know exactly where to meet your mate under the clock at 8. These weren't just habits, they were the scaffolding of daily life. You'd stop at the newsagent on the corner for your paper, exchange a few words about the weather or the football. On the way back, you'd duck into the sweet shop, maybe buy 50 pence worth of boiled sweets from the jars that lined the wall. The lady behind the counter would remember what you liked. These tiny interactions built up over time into something more substantial, a sense of being known and belonging to a place. The high street wasn't just where you bought things, it was where you checked in with your community, a stage where everyone played their small recurring part in the town's ongoing story. The high street was never just about buying things. Research into mid-century Britain found that 66% of trips to town centres had nothing to do with shopping at all. People came to meet friends under the clock tower, to watch the world go by from a cafe window, to pass time between buses. The high street functioned as a social stage where everyday dramas played out. Young people gathered at familiar spots outside the electrical showroom in Brighton, at the coffee bar jukebox in Leicester. Teenagers walked the bunny run in Coventry, boys going one way and girls the other, eyeing each other up. Children treated department stores like playgrounds, racing up escalators and riding the lifts for fun. This was where you bumped into neighbours, where you heard local gossip, where you arranged to meet someone for the first time or maybe the last. Many people met their future spouses on these streets, getting engaged outside jewelers' shops. The high street gave you a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than your own household. It anchored you in the community. The rot set in earlier than you might think. Back in the 1970s and 80s, supermarkets started eyeing bigger premises. Town centres were expensive and cramped, so they moved out to the edges where land was cheap, and car parks could stretch for acres. Free parking was the killer. Why pay to wrestle a trolley through a crowded high street when you could load up at an out-of-town Tesco and not pay a penny? The big retail parks followed, then the American-style malls like Lakeside in 1990 and Bluewater in 1999. These places offered everything under one roof with climate control and plenty of space. Town centres tried to compete by building their own shopping centres, but the damage was done. Chain stores muscled out the family shops that had traded for generations. Your local butcher, baker, record shop, they couldn't match the prices or the rents. What vanished wasn't just shops, it was the bustle, the sense that this was where everyone went, where you'd bump into neighbours. That atmosphere just drained away.